Welcome back to the YouTube channel of the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we're delving deeper into the profound insights of meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. Your support means the world to us. We kindly ask you to like and share this audiobook, thus expanding its reach and allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that you receive immediate notifications when new content is uploaded. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, cultivating a community dedicated to enlightenment and inner tranquility. We are sincerely grateful for your involvement in our mission to make these transformative teachings universally accessible. Let's now begin today's reading. See your thoughts as strange. August 17, 2018. Try and settle into the body as you feel it from within, what the texts call form, and try to find a sense of pleasure here. Explore the breath to see how it feels, and adjust it so that it feels just right. Not too long, not too short, too deep, too shallow, too heavy, too light. When the breath feels good, try to notice where there's a sense of ease, and think of it spreading around the body like a liquid that can seep through all the little nooks and crannies of the body and allow your awareness to follow it. Or if you want, you can spread the awareness out there first, and then think of the breath following the awareness. The important thing is that you try to fill the body with a sense of well-being. Fill it with your awareness. Then, as for any thoughts that go out into the world, out into your visual field or your oral field, just let them go. Try to have a sense that you belong here. This is normalcy. The Thai Ajahns talk about the mind settled in, at ease, at equanimity, as the normal state of mind, or the mind at normalcy. In the same way as when you're observing the precepts, they say that your behavior is finally at normalcy. But for most of us, that's not our sense of normal. Distraction is our normalcy. The desires that flow along with that distraction out into the sensory realm. That's where we normally are. One of the points of meditation is to change your sense of normal. This is one of the reasons why we leave the activity, say, of a city, the activity of even little towns or farms, and come to a quiet place like this. Because when you're staying out there, the way everybody else is behaving seems normal, but here you want to be able to pull out and say, is that really normal? It's good to get out and have a sense of society being strange. Right now it's especially strange, but even when society seems to be relatively normal, going its ordinary way, from the point of view of the Dhamma, it's still strange. People going along with their defilements. As Ajahn Mun used to say, whatever culture there is in the world, it's a culture of people with defilements. There's only one culture that's not, and that's the culture of the noble ones, and the noble ones don't think like other people do. We need to learn how to see their thinking as normal if we're going to learn how to benefit from their teachings, so that when thoughts of, say, sensual desire or anger come up, you want to see them as strange. This is one of the reasons why we have the contemplation of the body. You can think of all the pleasures that revolve around the body, and yet look what you've got when you take the body apart. Look at a diagram of the inside of the body, and you can see that it's very bizarre. If you were to take all the different organs out and put them on the floor, you'd run away. They'd be so strange. Yet when they're all sewn up nicely inside, you can look at a human body and actually desire it. You can look at your own body in the mirror, and it seems normal. It seems okay. There's an incongruity here, and the contemplation of the body, as with all the other contemplations that deal with our defilements, is meant to show how incongruous our desires are. We have to turn a blind eye to so many things in order to stoke our greed, stoke our lust, stoke our anger, and put the mind into what the Buddha would say is an abnormal state. Yet for us, that's the spice of life. So we have to learn how to change our views, to see that we have a weird taste in spices. This is one of the reasons why we try to develop this sense of well-being in the body as our refuge. As the Buddha points out, if we didn't have any other alternative to pain, we'd just go for nothing but sensuality, because that would be the only other option out there offering some pleasure. So, it's important that you find a strong sense of pleasure simply sitting here in the body as it's felt from inside. That's a part of your awareness that our culture tends to block off. We don't have much of a vocabulary to describe the body as it feels from within. All the interesting things in the world seem to be happening out there, where our vocabulary is huge. Yet actually we're in here, and it's unnatural for us to be pulled out there so much. So, get back in touch with how your body feels from within, and learn how to relate to it in a balanced way. Some people, especially if they have a lot of suppressed emotions, will find weird energies moving in different directions in the body and getting stuck in different parts. You have to think of everything opening up, all the channels open, open, open. Any excess energy can flow out the palms of the hands, the soles of the feet. If something's stuck in your head, think of it going out the eyes, the ears, or down through the throat. In other words, learn how to have a sense that you can be with your inner awareness of the body without pushing it in unhealthy directions. Learn how to compensate for any bad habits you may have developed subconsciously in the past around the energy flow in the body, and keep compensating until things feel balanced. Then tell yourself, this is normalcy. As for thoughts that pull you out, learn to look at them as strange. As the Buddha said, discernment comes down to seeing things as other, as separate. Yet we live in our thought worlds, we let them envelop us, and for us they're normal. Your desires, your angers are very much yours. If we could take everybody's thoughts and put them out in a lineup, you'd probably be able to pick out your thoughts very quickly. There's a certain you-ness to your thoughts that seems normal. It's one of the reasons why you go for them and keep going for them, again and again and again. But stop and think. In all the many lifetimes you've had, you've been many different kinds of people with lots of different ideas about what's beautiful, what's ugly, what's fair, what's not fair. And that's just counting your times as a human being. You've probably been other types of beings as well. Different genders, different races, different species. We've been through all of them. And each time, it was me, my thoughts, my ideas, my taste of things, my desires. But just think about what you were like maybe 200 years ago and how strange that would be. Well, in the same way, learn to look at yourself right now as strange, especially your thoughts, so that you can have a much more solid sense of feeling at home here, belonging here with your breath, and seeing anything that would pull you away as alien. It's like learning a different language or going to a different country. At first, you're struck by how strange that language is, and how strange that country is, but if you stay there long enough, get fluent enough in the language and live with the customs, it becomes more normal. Then you come back home, and home seems strange. That's precisely the attitude you should learn around your thoughts. They really are strange. The fact that you would desire something, the fact that you would have lust for something, the things that get you angry. If you can see them as strange, it's easier to pull out of them. Otherwise, you live in them. They become a becoming, a whole world in which you take on an identity, and these states of becoming are what cause us to suffer. They require feeding, and the feeding entails suffering. In fact, the Buddha's word for clinging, which he identifies with suffering, can also mean to feed. You take on this identity where you have to feed, which means you've got to suffer. So any craving that would pull you in that direction, you've got to see as strange, as alien. Otherwise, you go for it again and again and again. Learn to see your thoughts as strange. See the mind centered here in the body with a sense of balance as normal. That puts everything else in the right perspective. The Prison Break. May 29, 2019. Ajahn Suwat once made an interesting observation. He noted that all beings are looking for happiness, all beings want happiness, and what that shows is that we don't have it. We're suffering. Otherwise, why would we search for happiness? Why would we need it? As he said, we're born into suffering. If you survive birth, you don't just lie there happily. You cry. You squirm around. And for the rest of your life there's a lot of squirming. There's a basic sense of discontent we all have. What the Buddha does with his teachings is to tame that discontent, to civilize it and put it to good use. Think of the teachings called the customs of the noble ones. There are 4 altogether. The first three say you should be content with what you've got in terms of food, clothing, and shelter, and you focus your discontent someplace else. That's what the fourth custom is. You want to learn how to delight in developing and delight in abandoning. To delight in developing skillful qualities and delight in abandoning unskillful ones. You do this because you realize you can't stay content with what you've got in your mind. There are things you've got to develop and things you've got to abandon if you're going to be happy. If you want to do it well, you have to delight in doing it. This principle comes down to heedfulness, realizing that just because you want to escape from something, you can't simply run away. If you're going to escape for good, you have to plan it well. It's like those movies where they have a very well-planned prison break. If you're trying to get out of the prison, then if you just rush at the guards, they'll shoot you, and that's the end of that. You have to figure out very carefully how to make a clean escape, and you have to take pleasure in working out all the details, in doing it right. That's how heedfulness trains your discontent. We want to let go. We want to go all the way to awakening. We want that happiness. So, we have to follow the steps. Think of the Buddha's image of the cow. It's in a nice pasture. It's got nice grass and nice water in the pasture, but it looks over to another hill, across the ravine, and there's another pasture. It wonders, what's the grass like over there? What's the water like over there? But because the cow is foolish and inexperienced, it doesn't know how to go down into the ravine and get back up in either direction. As a result, it gets stuck in the ravine and loses the grass and water it had to begin with. The Buddha's example here is an image for people who are beginning to gain some concentration, and they're discontent. They want to move on. But first you've got to learn how to tame your discontent. Realize that if you're going to do a good job, if you really want to get out of suffering, you have to follow the steps. The part of the mind that's really in a hurry, that's really impatient, that has to be tamed. We usually think of the mind taming the heart. The mind understands things but can't get the heart to go along, yet the heart sometimes goes along too well. It's in too much of a hurry. It hears about all these wonderful things along the path and at the end of the path, and it says, gee, I'd really like that. I want to go right now. But when it can't get there right now, it gets disillusioned, upset, and loses interest. You've got to train the heart to develop some patience and persistence. That's why we have the practice of generosity, why we have the practice of virtue. You're training the heart and mind in the basic habits you need as a meditator, and you want a good foundation. Now, it's not the case that you have to wait until your foundation is good before you start meditating. You meditate while you're developing your generosity and your virtue. These practices have to work together, but you have to realize that they all require work. One of the reasons the Buddha sets out steps in the path is that he's taking a really big job and breaking it down into little pieces, so that you can content yourself for the time being with this piece, and then, when you've mastered that, you remind yourself, okay, you can't rest here, there's another piece. That's what heedfulness tells you. You can't rest there. There are some good things along the path if you get the mind into concentration. There's a sense of well-being, even a sense of rapture, but that's not good enough. Your heedfulness and discontent keep pushing at you, but your heedfulness also has to say, I've got to do this well, so I'll have to focus on the next step, and only when I've got it solid, will I think about the next step after that. So while you're here, what is the next step? Well, basically you stay with the breath, then you adjust the breath to the point where it's good enough to settle down with. We're not here to create the perfect breath. We're here to get the breath good enough so that the mind will be willing to settle down in the body. If you don't adjust things with the breath, the body's not a very comfortable place to stay. It has its aches and pains here and there. But, as you breathe comfortably, breathe around the pains, breathe through them. Allow the bands of tension to dissolve away, it gets to the point where it is good enough to stay. Then you allow the mind to stay. Try to keep your gaze as steady as possible, and energy will come up. The Buddha's image is of a spring in a lake. It keeps flowing and flowing and flowing, and the rain keeps pouring down, so that the spring doesn't run dry. That's satisfying for a while, but sometimes it gets to be too much. That's when you think of the energy flowing out the hands, flowing out the feet, flowing down the tailbone out down into the ground, flowing out your eyes. Or think of adjusting your focus so that instead of focusing on the gross energies in the body, you focus on the subtler ones that are right there in the same place. Try to erase any perception you have of the skin of the body holding things in. Remember, the skin is full of pores. The atoms of the skin are largely space. Hold that perception in mind, and the excess energy can diffuse. It has nothing to push against. Now there's an even subtler level of well-being. Stay with it long enough, keeping your range of awareness wide open, until everything in the body seems so well connected that the breath energy can feed itself. In other words, if there's a lack of energy in some part of the body, the energy in another part will flow right there. You get to the point where you don't even need to breathe in and out. This is what the Buddha means by the stilling of bodily fabrication. The mind gets really, really still and very content. The body is still. The breath is still. And you can stay there. That's when you can see events in the mind clearly, because that's what we're here for. To see the movements of the mind. To make sure that the sense of the body is fully balanced at this stage, Ajahn Fuang would have you experiment first with thinking about the different elements in the body. Earth, water, wind, fire. You start first with the breath, which is part of the wind element. The breath is all smoothed out now, so you think about fire, the warmth. Notice where there's warmth in the body, which spots seem to be warmer than others, and then focus there and allow that sense of warmth to spread out and fill the body. If it gets excessive, then you think of coolness, the water. Where's the coolest spot in the body? Focus on that and then let that sense of coolness spread out. Then you think of the solidity. The whole body is solid. Then you try to think of mixing these elements together so that everything feels right, not too cold, not too hot, not too light with the breath, not too heavy with the solidity. Get it just right. What you've done is to learn about the power of perception, how it can affect your experience of the body. You've learned how to control your perception steadily, so that when you go to the perception of space, thinking of the space filling the areas between all the atoms in the body and going out beyond the skin, your ability to hold on to that perception is a lot more solid. Then you can ask yourself, what is it that knows the space? There's an awareness, just your sense of awareness sitting right here. Focus your attention there. In other words, you learn how to take things apart, bit by bit by bit. As the mind settles down like this, you're peeling away this layer, peeling away that layer, and it's in the peeling away that you see the movements of the mind, how the mind puts things together. That's when both the mind and the heart are ready to start letting some of these things go. You've been letting go of certain things just to get the mind in concentration, but now you can see things a lot more clearly, because you've established a good foundation, and you sensitized yourself to what's going on as you stilled everything down. It's like trying to find a mouse in a wall. Say you've heard a scratching sound in the wall. If you've got the generator going and your TV going and your stereo going and your refrigerator going, you're not going to hear the scratchings in the wall clearly enough to locate them. You've got to turn off all these machines, make less and less and less noise yourself, and then you can start picking out the little sounds that you wouldn't have heard otherwise. That's how you can locate the mouse and catch it. In the same way, as your sensitivity gets more refined, you begin to see how even little subtle things in the mind can have their harm. We started out with blatant suffering. We learned how to work our way through that, so that we now see subtle things and realize, even this, too, is stressful. You're raising your standards for what counts as well-being. This is how the mind gets ready to start peeling things away even more radically. But you can do it only because you've trained both the heart and the mind very patiently, and gone through the proper steps. Again, it's like the prison break. You do the steps very carefully. You have to be subtle so that you won't be detected. Or it's like one of those old Mission Impossible episodes on TV, where they're assigned something impossible. It seems impossible, but bit by bit by bit, very delicately, very carefully, they can do it, so that the mission impossible turns into a mission possible. A mission accomplished. If they just rushed at the evil person would have killed them, and that would have been that. They had to do everything very subtly and very skillfully. Well, that's what we're doing as we get the mind to settle down. We're learning about the subtleties in the mind by developing our skills. This is what it means to delight in developing. You take delight in the subtleties, you take delight in doing things well, almost to the point where you forget why you're here. Still, there's that discontent that's eating away at the mind, and your heedfulness reminds you that even though things get really comfortable as you're settled in, you're not meant to stay there. The Buddha said there's something even better, something that's genuine heartwood. His image is of going through the parts of a tree and not contenting yourself with the leaves or the bark or the softwood. You want the heartwood, something solid that really is worthy of your contentment. In other words, once you've got it, you don't need anything more. That's what it means to be really content. We can't clone contentment by saying, well, let's just be okay with whatever. That aborts the path right there and leaves you settling for things less than ideal. But at the same time, we can't let our discontent run wild. We have to tame it. We have to civilize it. As you follow the steps, then step by step you get out of the prison, by learning how to take delight in being really subtle in how you understand your mind, how you deal with your mind. As Ajahn Fuang once said, if we could take Nibbana by storm, everyone would have gone there a long time ago. It's because it's delicate work that we haven't gotten there yet. So learn how to take some delight in the delicate work. This is why the Buddha taught so much about the path in detail. He didn't teach much about Nibbana. He said, in effect, do the path carefully, and the path will get you there. That's what counts. Be precise. March 9, 2019. We're here to observe our minds. But we start by observing the breath, because the breath is like an object we're working on, and you see the results of your actions in the object. That way you get more sensitive to what you're doing. Say, for instance, you see a basket. Looks pretty easy, shouldn't be any problem making one. So you make one. Then you look at your basket and compare it with the original basket. You see that they're two very different things. Some people give up at that point. Other people say, well, there must be something I'm doing wrong. So they go back and make another basket, look at what they're doing, and then look at the resulting basket. What in that basket still needs to be improved? The raw materials are not all that different. What you've done with them is what makes all the difference. And you see your actions in the final product. When you see they're not giving good results, you have to go back and change what you do, make a new basket in a better way, and then a better way. That's how you get more sensitive to what you're doing. That's the whole purpose of the concentration. To get more sensitive to what the mind is doing. This, of course, relates to the heart of the teaching. The Four Noble Truths. We're doing something in the mind that's giving rise to suffering, and we're suffering because of our ignorance of what we're doing. We also have the potential to do something that puts an end to suffering. To see the difference, you have to focus on what you're doing. You have to learn how to see your actions in the results, see the connection between cause and effect, and see the difference between different causes and different effects. That requires some very sharp and consistent powers of observation, which is another reason why we want to observe the mind in concentration. The concentration allows us to see subtle things we couldn't see otherwise. So, you focus on the breath. You begin to realize that the way you focus on the breath, the image you hold in mind of the breath, and the perception of the breath, are all going to have an effect on how the breath feels, whether it's going to be a good place to stay or not a good place to stay. But those are things you can change. If they're not good, try something else. If that's not good, try something else again. When it is good, learn how to stay with it. Observe what you've got. It's all too tempting when you read about the different levels of jhana to want to race right through them. But you don't see anything by racing through them. We're not here to cut little notches in our jhana belts. We're here to observe the mind. And one good way of observing the mind is to get it in a good state of concentration. The next step is to keep it there until you really get to know it. Try to see what problems you have in keeping it there. One very common problem is that you slip off the breath and go into the sense of ease, and things get murky, blurry. It's like going into a dream world, what Ajahn Lee calls delusion concentration, where things are very still, but you're not very clear about where you are. That kind of concentration won't give any insight into your actions. You have to realize there's a distinction between the breath and the pleasure. They're going to both be there in almost the same place, but they are different things. The pleasure is the result. The shape of the breath, the way you're breathing, comes from your actions and intentions. So, maintain the intention to stay with the breath, and learn to see that even though these things come together, they are different. When you learn how to be precise in your observation, the mind gets into stronger concentration and allows you to see things even more precisely. You begin to see that your inner discussion about staying with the breath, adjusting the breath, becomes a disturbance. And when you really, clearly see that it is a disturbance, that's when you let it go. Don't let it go beforehand. In other words, it's not simply because you're told that if you want to get farther along in the concentration, that's what you've got to do. You've got to really see for yourself that you're doing something disturbing and unnecessary at the same time. This is one of the reasons why when Ajahn Fuang was teaching meditation, 1. He wouldn't talk about jhana at all. And 2. If anyone asked him about what was the next step or the next step after that, he'd say, "Don't worry about that yet. Worry about where you are right now. If it's something good, keep it up. And whether it's jhana or not jhana, as long as it feels good, stick with it. When you see something disturbing, drop that and see if you can still stay in the concentration." Now, sometimes, something seems like a disturbance, but if you drop it, you've lost your concentration, which is a sign you're not ready to drop it yet. Go back and pick it up again. In other words, don't let your concentration be overly ruled by the texts or by what you've heard about concentration. Focus directly on what you're doing right now, to see what's a cause and what's a result. When they separate out clearly, you can move on. Drop anything that's getting in the way of allowing the mind to settle down more fully and really be at its ease. But hold on to whatever you need. Ajahn Suwat gave a Dhamma talk on how you should regard anything that comes to disturb your concentration as stress, as suffering, even though it may not seem all that onerous or heavy. That's how the perfection of concentration leads to discernment, moving it into the Four Noble Truths. But you don't have to think in terms of the Four Noble Truths. Just think, what is this disturbance right here? And how can I stop it? Try to be very precise in how you observe these things. We had a question this afternoon about what a big problem the ego is. Well, ego means a lot of things, and it involves a lot of different actions, some of which are actually skillful, and some of which are not. It's too big a concept to function in the analysis that'll succeed in getting rid of a problem. You have to see the problem in action and divide it up into useful units. In other words, you have to see what you're doing in action because the problem lies in your actions. There may be ignorance there. There may be craving there. You need to be very precise in seeing the steps and how these things arise, how they pass away, because only when you see the steps can you begin to see, oh, this is the allure. This is why I go for them. And it may be probably will be something you hadn't expected at all. There may be something hiding behind what you thought was a perfectly fine idea, a perfectly justified idea. You have to dig down to find the real reason, and when you find it, you'll ask yourself, well, why go for that? It'll obviously. This is one of the reasons why, when we're getting the mind concentrated, everything that gets in the way, no matter how right or how good your ideas may seem, has to be regarded as a disturbance, a distraction. Develop a certain amount of skepticism toward your ideas, so that when the mind feels tempted to go for them, you can begin to ask, well, why? You learn not to trust the voice that says, well, of course this is good. This is right because maybe there's something else going on as well. The more precise you are in seeing things, the more clearly you see where the allure is. Then you can compare it with the drawbacks. When you can see these things clearly, that's when it begins to hit home. Yes, this really is something you do want to get past, something you do want to escape from. Even though there is a general tendency to reduce the Buddha's teachings to a few slogans or a few general concepts, still, as practitioners we have to resist that tendency. We're looking for the particulars. Why this disturbance? Why this distraction? Why do you go for it? How did it start? Where does it start? Does it really last, or does it come and go? When it goes, why does it go? What's the difference between the mind state when it picks it up and the mind state when it drops it? What happened to the allure? Sometimes the allure comes when you pick it up, but then it fades very quickly. You drop it, but then you forget and you pick it up again. Why did it fade? You want to slice things very finely this way. And your ability to slice things finely has to come from your practice of concentration, when you can see things distinctly like, this is the breath, and this is the ease that comes from the breath. They're two separate things even though they're right there together. A lot of discernment has to be developed in the course of getting the mind into concentration and maintaining the concentration, particularly insight into what you're doing. The breath becomes the object you shape with your actions. You look at the shape of the breath and you learn a lot about your actions. You can start discerning where your lack of skill is. And you can do something about it, which is much better than dealing in abstractions or imposing ideas you picked up from books, even from the teachings of the Ajahns. Their words may be right, but sometimes the way you understand them is not quite right. How do you make it right? By looking carefully at what you're doing. Be precise in your observation of what you're doing. Be precise in the observation of the object you've made here with the breath, the concentration you've made by staying with the breath. That's how you begin to arrive at some insights that really do make a difference in the mind. They show you something that's been here all along, but you haven't seen it because you haven't been looking in the right place, or haven't been looking precisely enough, or haven't been asking the right questions. But it's here to be seen. The more precise you are in chasing away distractions, the quicker you are to chase away distractions, the more precise you are in how you focus on things and the perceptions you use, then the more the practice of concentration really will be good for the mind. It'll show you areas where you've been foolish, areas where you've been blind, things we normally don't like to see, but things we have to learn how to see if we want to stop suffering. Appreciating your practice. January 5, 2019. When Ajahn Fuang taught meditation, he would hand out a copy of Ajahn Lee's Method 2, and in Method 2, there was a section that referred to jhana. After he'd have people read the whole of Method 2, he'd have them put it aside and say, focus on your breath, but he wouldn't talk about jhana at all. He would talk about the mind in relationship to the breath. Ways of working with the breath, ways of working with the mind, ways of putting them together. When teaching individual people, he would ask them to describe their experience. Then, from their experience, he would give recommendations using their vocabulary. Part of the reason for this was to make sure that people didn't start competing with one another over their jhanas. And part of it was to get them really sensitive to what was getting better insight as they meditated, because this is an important part of the practice. If you're constantly measuring yourself against the texts, you're measuring yourself against ignorance, basically. You think maybe the texts mean X or Y, but you don't really know. What you can know is that while you're practicing, the mind can settle down more than it could before, or there's a greater sense of ease than there was before. You begin to see that certain unskillful ways of relating to your body, relating to the mind, relating to the world outside all fall away. And you want to appreciate the skill that you're developing in and of itself, without any reference to how other people may be skillful or how they or some text might measure your progress. You want to be able to see for yourself that things are getting better and, as the Buddha would say, learn how to delight in that. One of the customs of the noble ones is learning how to delight in abandoning and delight in developing. When you see, say, that some greed you used to have is just not there anymore, or your tendency to get angry over things is getting weaker, then delight in the fact that you're able to abandon those unskillful things. As for a sense of well-being inside, a sense of being more settled, learn how to delight in that, too, because this delight is what keeps you on the path. You see for yourself that it really is worthwhile. You don't need books to tell you. I know of one meditation method in Asia where if they think you've gained stream entry, they have you listen to a tape to tell you what fetters you've abandoned. But if you've really abandoned them, you don't need to be told. You know for yourself. If the method is constantly concerned about how someone reading the texts would judge what you've done, it makes the worth of your practice depend on somebody else. The real worth of the practice is what you can see for yourself and how you're developing your mind. This is how the Buddha developed his practice. He didn't have any texts against which to measure his progress. But he noticed when he could get the mind to settle down with the breath, and how he could get the mind to settle down with the breath. He noticed the ways that worked and the ways that didn't work. He judged his meditation based on the level of stress and suffering still in the mind, and the types of stress and suffering that had been abandoned. So focus on what you're doing right now and try to be sensitive to what's changing, realizing that it will sometimes take a while to see progress. One of the images in the canon is of a ship with sails all rigged up. It's been pulled up on shore and just left there. Gradually, the ropes and the sails rot away, the wood rots away. If you go today and look at it and go tomorrow and look at it, you won't see any difference. But over time, you begin to realize, oh, yeah, it is rotting away. Another image is of using a hammer. The handle of the hammer will wear down over time. But if you look at it today and then look at it tomorrow, you won't see any difference. In the same way, sometimes it takes a while to see progress in your practice. Some changes are gradual. Others, though, are more noticeable. You can see a thought coming up that used to hook you and make you miserable, but now it comes up and yet doesn't make you miserable anymore. Appreciate that. You've made progress. Ajahn Mahabua talks about seeing little tiny flakes of bark get chipped off the trees of his defilements, and he took a lot of satisfaction in that. So, when you see that there are areas where you used to get angry, or used to get lustful, or used to get greedy, used to be fearful, but it's not happening anymore, at least not as easily, you've made progress. Appreciate that, because the whole purpose of the practice is to see that you're making yourself happier in a totally innocent way. Innocent happiness is really rare in the world. It comes down basically to three things: generosity, virtue, and meditation. When you find an innocent happiness that's good for you, it's good for other people, too. By finding a reliable happiness, it's also good for other people, too, because if your happiness isn't reliable, you're frustrated and you start taking it out on others. If you've got something of solid worth inside and you know for yourself that it's of solid worth, then you feel less threatened by other people, less exasperated by their behavior. So, the search for a solid happiness inside is not a selfish thing. Think of the Buddha's instructions to Rahula. If you see that you've made a mistake, be willing to talk it over with someone you trust, out of the desire to learn. If you're going to be proud of your desire to learn. A certain amount of pride is necessary, the confidence that you have the ability to do this. If you realize that you've done something well, then, as the Buddha said, take joy in that fact and continue training. In other words, use that joy as part of the motivation to stick with it and get better. Now, as you find joy in the practice like this, then the changes of the world, aging, illness, death, separation, don't hit the mind so hard. Appreciate that. This appreciation comes under the general heading of empathetic joy, mudita. We often think about empathetic joy as meaning not resenting the good fortune of other people. But it also means appreciating their goodness and knowing that their goodness will lead to good results, and appreciating your own goodness as well. Remember, you're included in all beings when you say, "May all beings be happy. May all beings not be deprived of the good fortune they've attained." You're one of those all beings. So, appreciate your practice. Appreciate the progress you make in the practice. This kind of appreciation helps pull you out of your likes and dislikes. You begin to realize the happiness that comes from developing a skill. The way you treat your own mind can be turned into a skill. It's not the happiness of simply having nice sights, sounds, smells, tastes, or tactile sensations. You realize you've got something better that you can hold on to when the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations turn bad. So develop an appreciation for your practice. Find joy in the effort. Find joy in the times when you make the effort and it actually succeeds. As for the times when it doesn't, learn how to give yourself pep talks. Remind yourself that even the Buddha made mistakes. But let the thought that there's a goal you haven't attained be like the tension on a bow when you're shooting an arrow. If there's no tension on the bow, the arrow doesn't go anywhere. The realization that I've got progress I need to make. There are areas where I'm still lacking. Don't let that get you down. Make it a type of motivation. Okay, there's work to be done, and I know a path for getting out of the situation my mind is in right now. That thought can act as motivation for the effort that'll actually get you to the point where you can master the practice. All too often you hear, don't have any goals. Just be in the present moment. That's like a bow that hasn't even been strung. It just sits there. It can't shoot any arrows, it doesn't go anywhere. But the practice is meant to go someplace. It's meant to arrive at an attainment, as the Buddha said, where you come to know what you haven't known before, to attain what you haven't attained before, to realize what you haven't realized before. We are going someplace. The someplace will be right here at the mind, but it's the mind as it changes through the practice. And as it changes bit by bit, you don't have to worry about the noble attainments or jhana or anything. Just ask yourself, is the mind more still than it was before? If it's not, what can you do to make it more still, more solid, with a greater sense of belonging here? In a lot of ways, the practice is basically learning how to feel comfortable in your own skin. That's a lot of what concentration practice is about. As for the insights, an insight is useful if it actually has an impact on helping you develop some dispassion for things that used to get you worked up. That's how you know if an insight is worthwhile. You can read in the books about the insights you're supposed to have, and then try to impose them on what you're doing. Sometimes the lessons from the books are helpful, but sometimes they can be accompanied by pride or an overestimation of what you've accomplished. That gets in the way. So, simply notice when an insight comes. What does it do for the mind? How does it help the mind? If it helps the mind, fine. And if you find that tomorrow the same insight doesn't do anything, that doesn't mean the first insight was bad. It means simply you've got to develop more subtlety in your insight, to try things from a different angle. But appreciate the fact that yesterday it did help, so maybe today you can find something that will help as well. Take heart from the example of those who have gone before you. This is why we have the contemplation of the noble Sangha. People who started out as ordinary people, just like us, and yet were able to develop their potentials into something really noble. It is possible. We have their examples. That's meant to give us encouragement. How did they do this? They did it for themselves. They judged their practice for themselves and found that it was making them better people, making them happier, making them more reliable. They kept heading in that direction to see how far it would go. That's what we've got to do. Just keep heading in this direction. That'll give us a chance to taste some of the attainments they attained. And as you've appreciated your practice all along, it'll help you really appreciate the big things when they come, because you've learned how to read your actions and appreciate what they accomplish. No one size fits all. October 17, 2018. Ajahn Fuang, you see this in the forest tradition itself as a whole. There's no single forest tradition technique for meditation. When people came to see Ajahn Mun, he would assign different techniques to them. Ajahn Lee, who probably wrote out the most detailed of any of the techniques in the forest tradition, left at least 2 different ways of working with the breath, and he would talk about other topics as well. Recollection of the Buddha, contemplation of the body, the Brahmaviharas, contemplation of death. The point being that we all have to find a way that'll work for us, and in some cases, there's not just one way that'll work. In Ajahn Lee's explanation, you should have one technique that's your home base, And he recommended the breath because it's the safest of all the techniques. But you also need other techniques that function as the places where you go foraging. In other words, you may have to look for a solution, say, to the problem of lust, the problem of anger, or the problem of sleepiness. Sometimes the breath is not the topic for that particular problem, so you need to have a wide range of other tools to choose from. We see this in the canon as well. When the Buddha taught breath meditation to his son Rahula, he didn't teach just breath meditation. He taught contemplation of not self, contemplation of inconstancy. This was even before the breath. He taught contemplation of the elements, making the mind like the elements as a way of developing patience, contemplation of the body, the Brahmaviharas. In other words, he wanted Rahula to have a full set of tools for all the problems that might come up in the meditation. It's up to us to figure out which particular themes are going to work for us, and which ones will work at different times. There's no one-size-fits-all in the Buddha's teachings. More recently, especially in the 19th century when Asia was amazed by the West's superiority in terms of firepower, at least they attributed it to the fact that the West was able to pare manufacturing down to the essentials. So some Asians did the same thing to their own traditions. They did a reductionist take on the Buddha's teachings, for example, trying to boil everything down to one technique or two. But that ignores the fact that people all have that aspect where they are different. When a problem comes up, you have to find out which way is going to work for you. You have to learn how to read yourself, and that's a large part of discernment right there. If all you had to do were to know just one technique and apply it relentlessly, it wouldn't take much discernment. Any fool can do that. What's required in the middle way is that you figure out what's just right for you right now, what's appropriate for you right now, just as in the middle way. Sometimes intense effort is right, and sometimes very gentle effort is right, depending on what's needed. In seeing that, in ferreting out that point of just right, you develop your discernment. Sometimes you have to work really hard, sometimes you have to be very gentle, but in learning how to read yourself, that's how the discernment comes. You become more and more sensitive to what the mind is doing, what the results are, and what you need to do in response. That's the basis of insight. That's the basis of discernment. As you're trying to get the mind into concentration, the big questions are: how do you get the mind to settle down? How do you get it to enjoy where it is and get some refreshment out of it? Then there are the questions of insight. Here again, the Buddha didn't teach one single technique. He just set up some questions. How should fabrications be regarded? How should they be investigated? How should they be seen with insight? Those are the questions you ask, and it's in figuring out how to answer them that your discernment develops. That, as the Buddha said, is one of the signs of someone with real discernment. That he or she knows how to answer a question. It's not that we're trying to clone awakening. All the tools the Buddha gave for discernment are tools for directing your questions. Even the teachings on inconstancy, stress, and not self are questions to ask. If something comes up in the meditation and you find yourself gravitating toward it, getting stuck on it, ask yourself, is this constant or not? If you can see any inconstancy in it, then that's a sign that it's not your goal. But then the next question is this a tool along the way? And that requires even more discernment. So take your basic techniques, make them your home base, and then learn how to read the mind to see where you are, and what type you are. As the Buddha said, there are some who start out with insight and go into tranquility, and others who start out with tranquility and go into insight, and then there are those who have to develop the two together. In his case, it seems that he developed the two together. The meditation technique that he taught most often was breath meditation. He taught it both as a concentration technique and as a discernment technique, because after all, with the breath you're trying to get things calm, but before you get things calm, the Buddha teaches you how to see things in terms of fabrication. The breath is bodily fabrication, in that it creates your sense of the body right now. Then there's mental fabrication, perceptions and feelings. In both cases, the Buddha says, once you see that process of fabrication, you learn how to calm it. In that way, You're doing both insight and tranquility at the same time. Then there's verbal fabrication in the instructions themselves. You're telling yourself to breathe in and out sensitive to the whole body, breathe in and out sensitive to whatever potential there is for rapture or pleasure, trying to develop it as much as you can. Those are things you tell yourself to do. That's verbal fabrication. Once there's a sense of ease and well-being, you try to spread it around. These instructions actually raise questions. How do you breathe in a way that gives rise to rapture? How do you breathe in a way that gives rise to pleasure? How do you spread it around? Ajahn Lee gives some helpful tips by having you work with the breath energies in the body. How do you breathe in a way that gives you a sense that the whole body is breathing and that it's all breathing together? In learning how to do that, you begin to notice that there are times when you push things too much and other times when you're not pushing them enough, times when you have to be allowing, and a few times when you have to force things. The question is, which? When? That's something you've got to learn how to read. How to develop your sensitivity to what you're doing and the results that you're getting, and to figure out what's right for you right now. In this way, we take advantage of the fact that we are different and not only different from one another. Each mind goes through different stages. It'll have its different defilements that'll require different approaches, so it has to learn how to read what's going on and to foster some sensitivity. There can be no discernment without this sensitivity to what the mind needs. Think of the image of the cook who learns how to read his master. The foolish cook doesn't bother. He just keeps churning out food, which the master may like or may not like, but the master finally decides he's sick and tired of this cook because the cook isn't paying any attention. The cook who pays attention to what the master seems to like and who provides more of that. That's the cook who gets rewarded. So try to be sensitive to what's needed right now and have a range of tools that you can pick up to deal with whatever contingency comes along. That's how the mind both settles down and gains insight. The concentration itself becomes more sensitive. Your insights become more sensitive. And that sensitivity is what will take you where you want to go. In harmony with the teachings of the Buddha, we emphasize the profound importance of sharing wisdom far and wide. Presently, we've made this extensive 1,000-page work accessible through audio format. The responsibility to further this noble cause now rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and the sharing of our content, you play a central role in the broad dissemination of these teachings, which can benefit numerous others. Let's continue the timeless tradition of spreading knowledge and nurturing mindfulness for the betterment of humanity. We wholeheartedly invite you to join us in this endeavor, and together, we can make a profound and positive impact on the lives of many.